So, okay, we're good. We're good to go. So this is just it's really just the beginning and an introduction to astrology. Now some of you, I know a few of you already know a little bit more, and you'll have to have a bit of patience through the beginning things. But this class, we just have to do a basic beginning of it. We're going to go over how to draw and read a chart. We're going to look at the pattern types and the moon phases, and just get a good basic beginning to approach astrology. Then the next 2 weeks we'll be going on the signs of the zodiac, then the following 2 weeks on the houses, then the following 2 weeks on the planets, then on the aspects. So this is our basic structure of our webinar. Now, so I guess I should start with a kind of definition of astrology. What is astrology? People think it's so many things. Some people think it's a science. Some people think it's an art. Some people think it's a belief system. Some people think you can't believe in it. But to me, astrology, it's a language first and foremost. It's a way of communicating, talking. It's a way of talking about relativity and whatever's relative to each other. So it's the language of the stars, and it's a language of nature and how we relate to each other, and of relationships, of how we relate to the day and the night, how we relate to the seasons, how we relate to the planets or the new moons and the full moons, how we relate to each other. And it starts there. It's kind of it's just like the weather forecast. It's the nature of how we experience life. So in the natal chart of the time we're born, the implication is that at the moment you're born, you're pure potential. It's like a genetic code, a DNA. From the moment you're born, everything you could be is already in you. The challenge then becomes how much of your potentials you can make across your lifetime, how much you can make happen, how much experience you can deal with. So as we're going along in our life, there's strikes, there's weathers, there's storms, there's wars, there's things that interfere with how much we're growing or how much of our potentials we're getting. And there's things that bring out parts of our potential we would never have brought out. So when we're looking at a chart, we're looking at the DNA or the psyche of a person. We see the basic patterns and the basic tendencies of someone. We see some of their strong points and weak points. But one of the things, astrology measures how we're connected to life. It doesn't measure the soul. It doesn't measure your spirit. Those are mystical things that are beyond measurement. They're not something that can be measured. They're our inner presence. So no matter what happens to us in our life, our soul gains the experience. It gains a good experience. It gains a bad experience. The soul is still always absorbing and gaining the experience. But when it comes to souls, it's like we're all one soul. We're all a higher being. So it represents our higher being. And that higher being isn't measured in the horoscope or in astrology. What is measured is time and space and nature and how we're part of it and how we work with it and how different people can be. You begin to see the uniqueness of everyone and how alive everyone can be. So when you're thinking about astrology, I call it the language of relationships, the language of nature, but definitely the language. But it's not. A lot of people say it's a spiritual thing. It's not a spiritual thing. It's a natural thing. It's how we're connected. It's how we're alive and what we can do and what sometimes you see some things we may not be able to do so well. But the main distinction I want to make is your soul or your spirit is beyond the chart. It's on a higher plane. It's not what we're measuring by planets. What we're measuring by planets is how in this waking dream, in the world that we live in and move in, we see the changes happen, the attitudes we have, the type of things we attract or don't attract. We see the tension factors that we have and how we deal with tensions as we run into them. So we see a living dynamic, really very much like a weather forecast gives a forecast of the weather and things. We don't go out without checking the weather if it's going to rain or not. Well, astrology is giving a weather about the potentials of our lives and the things we're going to run into, and are we ready for them or not. It gives us a kind of map, a DNA. So this, the DNA, if you call it the DNA of the soul, it kind of is, because it's how the soul comes into life. Each of the planets, they represent how you're attached into life, how the soul comes in and what we're attached to. They're like the roots of our inner tree. Like, it's really our outer tree. It's how we're living. It's we have our roots into certain ways. We grow into a certain tree, but the potentials are in that seed. And when we're looking at the horoscope, it's like the DNA. It's like a map of what we can do and what we can be and who we are. But the DNA is not just a physical DNA of the size, shape, color, eyes. It also includes a social subjective DNA. So it's like the attitudes of our parents and our grandparents have a big factor in the social attitudes and circumstances have a big factor in conditioning how we run into life too. So in DNA, there's two sides of it. There's one that's the objective, scientific, measurable one, and then there's the social attitude. So like, what would be an example? If you, okay, say your grandmother had an abusive relationship and she ended up shooting her husband and killing him, and that was the end of it. And she brought up her daughter to hate men. Okay, that daughter would be your mother. She married someone. She has you. All of those attitudes accumulated across a few generations are still going to be coming into your life. You're still going to have to deal with some of those things. It's not right or wrong. It's just the way we get here. We all have conditioning from the family tree that we've come to, and that's part of how we are who we are. So when you start studying family trees and looking at these charts, you start seeing certain patterns that run right through a family tree. So this is just as a beginning, it's the language, and we want to build up a comfortableness with language. So how well does anybody know a language? How do we measure it? You know, if you know 100 words in English, you can still get by with 100 words simply. If you know 1,000 words, you can get by a little bit more. If you know 5,000, 10,000 words, well, then you're very literate and you know more than most people, and you could write and be educated on another level. So there's so many layers that people use a language on. Same with astrology. There's so many different layers people can use or work with it. So when we're first starting, we learn the signs, the houses, the planets and aspects, but little by little, probably for 6 months, even though you've learned all of them, you're seeing the information about the signs, or you might be seeing about the signs, and for 6 months, a year, that's your main source of input. Then the next year it may switch, and suddenly you may be seeing the nature of the houses may be coming up, and you're getting more and more information, and you're absorbing more things about the houses. Then that might go on for a year or two, and then you're kind of mixing the two together. Then suddenly you get a period when you're just understanding the planets, and you're getting so much information about the planets. And then it jumps to being the aspects. And after a number of years, these things come together, and you start seeing how the signs and the planets and the aspects and the houses all start working within each other. And this is developing the familiarity with the language and getting comfortable with it. At first, you just have to start. If you don't know anything, then you don't know anything wrong. You're starting and you don't know anything wrong, so that's okay. So sometimes if you know something, if you know a little, if you know some wrong things, it's hard to get rid of the wrong things that you know, or even admit that they're wrong. So this class, we're just starting from scratch. So if those of you know some things, it's going to be a bit of a review and maybe setting the foundation, so at least we're all on the same wavelength talking to each other. Okay, so there is a chat thing on the bottom. If you have to, you can make a note if you have to and put it down in there, and I think it'll notify me so I can see it. So let's see. Yeah, I just have to get used to working the webinar and organizing myself. So okay, now I'm going to take this off. So I'll get rid of this and pull up this. Okay, so when you first learn any language, you have to learn, well, sometimes you learn to speak and you're just trying to talk it, but usually eventually you have to learn the alphabet of that language and how it makes words and how the words make sentences. And as you get the alphabet, as you get words, you start unfolding your ability to be writing, reading, expressing yourself in a language. So when I start the class, we're just going to go over the really basics of astrology, because at first there's a certain number of basic symbols for the signs and the planets that you have to memorize. You just have to memorize them. To memorize them, probably if you took an evening and took a piece of paper, an hour, and write each of the signs out 10 or 12 times, or maybe 25 times, you'll remember them. The same with the planets. Once you've made them a few times, you'll remember them. So, and much of we're going to start with looking at a horoscope and how to build it up. But so when you see a horoscope, there's different layers of information. And when you first look at it, it's too much all at once. You see too much information. But we have to just slow it down and get it simple. So each of the symbols, I hope you can see my arrow, each of the symbols will represent a sign or a house or an angle or a planet. And once you get used to them, you'd be able to, even when you know it, if you just look at it, you get too much information all at once. So you have to slow it down and look at one thing at a time and go through a certain step-by-step approach to unfolding the depths of a horoscope. So this is just, now there's many different ways people draw a horoscope. So the typical American way, which publisher, or Western way, which was used before computers and stuff a lot, was just they put 12 houses on it, and they put everything into the 12 houses. And that's a basic way of teaching, but you don't see the degrees, you don't see things really accurate, and there's a little distortion. So one of the first things I'm going to get you to do is learn how to use a circular chart where there's each degree of the zodiac is shown around it, and then everything is put on that chart, so you're familiar with it. So yeah, I'm not gonna, basically this is just talking about having to get the symbols and memorize the symbols. And so here's the symbols of the signs of the zodiac. There's two sets of symbols. One is a creative one I've used with the I Ching. It's on the right, but really the basic symbols are on the left. They show the symbol, they show the color for that sign, and there's a whole dynamic to why a symbol is what it is. There's a whole metaphysics or geometry to understanding the patterns of Aries or Taurus, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. My main point right here is you make sure you get a copy of the screen, or if you can download this material, so you're familiar with each of the signs, and you just draw them out a number of times till you're familiar with them, and you memorize them, because instead of saying Gemini, you can see that Gemini has the two pillars, or if you see Taurus, you see there's a crescent and a circle. And all of the signs have different specifics, but mostly you learn it by just draw them out a couple of times till you're familiar with it. And you do this once or twice or over a couple of days, and by then you got it in. So anytime you see the symbol, oh, that's Aries, oh, that's Capricorn, oh, that. So you get used to that.